Praxis of Participation, a retrospection, is a platform for conversations around participation aimed at social equity and inclusion. It marks the celebrations of the 25 years of Praxis Institute for Participatory Practices. This edition is titled Participatory Grant Making, Co-scripting Change.
I think we know that all the different kinds of non-participatory grant making have had such a limited impact in terms of the changes that we all want to see. So to open up the conversation, I want to touch on three considerations about participatory grant making. Firstly, for me, participatory grant making starts with getting the time to have a deeper exposure to the realities of the local situation and who we are as organisations. We need to understand whether there is a meeting point between the grant maker and the local organisation. And we would hope for both the funder and the potential partner to get a good understanding of the nature of change that each organisation is trying to make and what is the perspective or the power analysis that's driving the effort. And I think we would hope that this deeper exposure to the local situation for us as grant makers, based on time in the field and dialogue with the local organisation, can actually help us to change our analysis and alter our preconceptions of what will make a difference in the context. So to give an example, it might involve learning that whereas we came into the situation with the idea of empowering adolescent girls to resist child marriage, in fact, it's the fathers who mostly need targeting. Or to give a different example, learning that whereas we thought it's best to help exploited workers to organise themselves through meetings inside the workplace, in fact, at that moment, they can only have free dialogue with each other if they meet as workers' groups in the villages. So it's details like this. So I think participation is about learning and changing, trying to build our capacity to actually be useful grant makers. That's the hope. And then secondly, going beyond our relationship with the local organisation grantee, how do we include the most marginalised within communities at every stage of the process of the programme? Our view is that hierarchies and coercion and exploitation exist within local communities and workplaces, and we need to try and find those local organisations that are rooted in the needs of the most marginalised within communities, not just those organisations who happen to be in the right places being helpful. And we're very aware that local organisations may or may not be in any way representative or run by those who are most marginalised. So, for example, in our experience, there are committed local organisations that don't always automatically engage with trafficking survivor groups in ways that help survivors to set their own priorities. Likewise, local organisations, as well as us as funders, can have perspectives that actually obstruct people getting organised together against injustices, whether or not those local organisations have good intentions. So, in other words, if our aim is to restore decision-making power and organising power to the participants, then we shouldn't assume that it's always enough to empower the local NGO grantees. And we also shouldn't assume that if we remove some of the funder directiveness on grantees, then more relevant and transformative work is going to automatically happen. So what can we do about it? I think one response might be that if we want to help local organisations to build trust with the people who are most marginalised and enable those people to have ongoing ownership of the work, there could be a role for us as grant maker to help the organisations to have access to the right participatory tools and approaches. And we really appreciate the many tools that Praxis has helped us with to do that. And finally, the third challenge is how to do grant making at a reasonable scale without it becoming standardized or imposed by the grant maker. And I think one of the answers to that is to ensure that local organisations who are helping the communities or worker groups are regularly coming together as a community of practice and asking questions about the results they're getting, what needs to change in their work, ideally with local participants and people with lived experience joining in that conversation. And I think this kind of open discussion can only be done if the grantees know that the grant maker can cope with some failures rather than expecting everything to be easy wins. So I think we feel that we're having a useful process when we see different local organisations making suggestions to each other, and through that actually changing the plan for the overall programme and the grant making priorities. So those are the 3 points that I wanted to just make as an opening. I want to recognise that as the Freedom Fund, we do have a long way to go. There's a couple of practical steps that we're taking to at least reduce the constraints on grantees. One is to offer unrestricted grants to some partners in different areas, both to organisations with whom we've got a mature partnership, as well as some small unrestricted grants to emerging survivor groups. And then also the second part is to help local organisations to connect with other funders, helping them with resources to make their fundraising possible, with the aim of reducing their dependency on our funding, ideally so that they can feel free to tell us that we're getting it wrong. So that's the points that I wanted to make. I'm going to bring in the other panelists and looking forward to hear what they have to say. And I think I'm starting with Paramita from the Oak Foundation. And I think the question that she's been asked to consider is, what does power shift in donor-grantee relationships look like in participatory grant making?
Thank you.
So I'll hand over.
Yeah. And thank you, Praxis, for organizing this, and congratulations for being such a trailblazer on what you do. And hello, Sachin and Joseph. I think Ginny has touched upon so many of the points that that was part of this question. I mean, she just gave that very useful foundation. I think if the ultimate objective of the participatory grant making is to ensure, inclusion of the primary constituencies in the program, the way to start is to look at what is the governance structure or the decision-making structure at the level of the donors, at the level of the partners, as well as in the communities. And as Ginny mentioned about the hierarchies, I mean, we know that there are some historical hierarchies that we have to deal with, and then there are these newer factors which are sort of precipitating the hierarchies further. So this is one opportunity in the hands of the donors to kind of really look at how can these hierarchies be dissolved over a period of time. And some of these hierarchies are really stubborn, so we really have to think about what are the ways in which we could do it. And for that, I think the key questions to ask here as the starting point is that who decides on the use of resources? I mean, usually the traditional way of deciding upon the use of resources do not naturally include the communities or the people who are most affected by the situation. So does it involve the people who are most proximate to the issue? I hate to call it a problem all the time because it's sometimes, we always use a very negative language. So I just want to be very careful about that. So how close or proximate are they to the issue? The second question to answer is that, is it a roundtable of the donors, partners, and the communities? And do they have an equal voice? Who is included and at what stage? I think for this to happen in most organizations, I think I'm also talking from the different organizations that I've worked with, and specifically from Oak, it required some adjustments and creating new processes here and there. I mean, if we are thinking that our existing processes would allow it to happen, then probably we need to rethink in that. And I see this applies to all organizations, who are intended and committed to make some durable changes. There is no need, I guess, for people to be convinced about this approach. People are really sold out. But what it really requires is that, the whole thing about the do how part of it, like how do you actually frame a program? What does a participatory grant making require, so that a program is essentially founded on a means that it allows people to have equal voices. So we need to have those tools and practices that allows community to identify the priorities. Oftentimes we tend to offer them solutions based on our experiences and interpretation of the situation, which is, I think, the foundational thing that we need to change. And I can we are so used to using this top-down approaches. This is something that we have to shed over a period of time. And this is more so with, I mean, as a donor, I think as a part of a donor organization, I think this is where we need to kind of show the behavior change. The part that Ginny mentioned, and I'm going to just little expand it, is any donor or partner who's signing on to this approach needs to be really patient, as PGM works best when the processes are aligned with the time scales of the communities. We can't impose our timelines on communities. So donors need to allow the partners to the time to invest in all these processes, which is namely the coming together of the communities, the identification of the priorities, the changes that they want to experience, not as changes as how we want to see it, mapping of the local resources, and thereby seeing that what is really there in the community and what else is required. Because we often start from a standpoint of understanding the vulnerability, right? And also, the fact that what is required to be a facilitator to bring this process of collective and inclusive action and reflection. Sadly, the usual rigid lock frame approach may not work here. So any donor who is thinking that, we start with a highly participatory approach, but then down the line we impose those rigid lock frames is here to get some surprises and some setbacks. So I think it requires you to change your behavior at every step in your grant making process and the program cycle. The foundation, through our experience, is like really served through participatory theory of change process that are led and validated by partners and communities. And this, of course, requires transitioning from a mindset that is focused only on results to developing a culture of learning. And Ginny, you just mentioned it. So I think this is really like the most important tool where each of the key participants, I have mentioned only three here, which is the donors, the partners, and the communities, enjoy a seat at the table and an equal seat at the table. Some of the things that Praxis does, which is about looking at outcome harvesting, learning journeys, storyboards, are some of the good options in this direction as to how we do it. And this as requires it kind of allows that shift of power, because every time we are taking this sort of step, we are actually giving some of the power. We're giving up some of the power that we have been historically enjoying. And finally, I guess donors have a great deal of responsibility here, where of understanding whether the partners are ready for the long haul to play a facilitating role and not like a role of taking the role of a decision maker. What are their current capacities to foster this? If you have to talk about a highly participatory, consultative, inclusive process, where communities are not only involved in the planning, but also in the execution and the learning process. So, and as I remember Tom saying this, that, communities are also hierarchical. So we need to have the skills to facilitate a level playing field. So not to say that, we go with whatever it is, but we also ask these critical questions in the communities. I guess there is, as a grant maker, we have to discern which type of programs lends itself to participatory grant making and others which do not allow us to it. So it's not that all of what we do can be put into this frame. There are certain programs where participatory grant making may not be feasible. So just make that decision. Of course, preparing for the flexibility in the use of resources, as ready-made solutions do not work. And so if you're looking at community-led solutions, then donors really need to be clear about, that there will be reallocation of resources, new things. And so the approvals and all of it needs to kind of be adjusted to that. And I think finally, from what I have understood is that how do we sort of influence our peers? Okay. And this is again where donors need to take some responsibility of supporting the dissemination of these processes, the tools through which this, and the tools, because this is the only way to allay the concerns, the fears of some of the donors who are sold out on the concept, but are not ready to invest on PGM. So I guess putting all the responsibility on the partners to make their point being made, and expecting that resources for PGM will flow is not going to be an easy task for them. So I think donors who have experienced it need to also be an equal partner in spreading the word around. Yeah, that's all from my side on this question, Jenny. Back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Paramita. I think one of the main points you were making was that this comes down to decisions about the use of resources. That's the fundamental thing here. If we haven't transitioned that in some way, then our participation is not so meaningful. I think also you touched on the idea of the need for patience, and I personally find that very challenging, of just bearing with the process that needs to happen. And the other thing I'm taking away is also about not focusing on the deficit that one finds, and just saying, oh, they're lacking this is vulnerability. The amount of writing that we do about vulnerability is just tremendous, and I think we need to be starting to think about strengths and what resources are there. So thank you so much for that contribution, Paramita. Now I think we're moving on to Dr. Joseph Sebastian, and the question that was put to him is participatory grant making for all? What are the challenges and opportunities of such an approach? So I'll hand over to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Ginny. I hope you can hear me. Yep. So, well, the quick answer to the first part of the question is yes. Grant making, participatory grant making is for all, is what I believe. Having said that, yes, there'll be nuances as to what extent of participation may be, actually practically feasible at different types of grant making that we might make. But then, before I go into that, I just want to take a couple of steps back. And in the development world that we see, starting from charity welfare to no one being left behind, rights-based, etc., the whole spectrum of it, we do realize that not just in India but across the world, we have this reality that all of these segments really are in force. So there are situations where welfare concepts have to be kind of taken up. There are realities where inclusiveness and probably what we all in this room are really vouching for are strongly taking forward. Now, having said that, I think the bottom line comes down to two dimensions of this. One, from the donor perspective, the grantor perspective, which I feel has got three key components there. One is has the resources. The second major component is that who holds the power, and for me, power is in terms of knowledge, specifically the areas of what we have. And the third one, and more importantly, from a developmental paradigm, is who holds the expertise of working with people. So you have three major components there. One.
So Dr. Sebastian's got frozen. Should we give him a minute and see if it restores itself? Otherwise, we'll ask Sachin to step in. I think we probably should let him come back to us a bit later. It's such a shame, he was saying such useful things. Anyway, Sachin, let me come on to you. So the question you were given is, how does participatory grant making change the experience of development initiatives for all stakeholders?
Thanks, Ginny, and congratulations, Praxis. So it's an organization that I once hoped I would join and work with. So I hold Praxis in very high esteem. And I think Praxis has been instrumental in kind of shaping, in many ways, some of our organizational and our own developmental journeys. So, Tom, on behalf of me, all the entire Praxis team, thank you very much for being there. I think one very important element about grant making is actually who chooses what needs to be done. So I mean, who decides what is the priority of work? And I think that's one place where a lot of organizations, and I tend to agree with Dr. Sukhdev Thorat, that a lot of donors tend to kind of forget that bit. So often grant making begins at the grant makers strategy level. So grant makers already have a strategy in mind when they begin their grant making process. So they and their teams and their think tanks have already worked out the entire plan of how things are going to work out. So I think one very important element that I think changes when you begin to start looking at it from a participatory process is that we tend to not be solution focused. So often grant making tends to be very solution focused. So there is a clear kind of route charted out and say that this is the solution to the problem, and now we are out there going and doing this work. So one very important change that participatory grant making brings about is that it tries to say that we are not going to be solution focused. We are going to kind of look at situations and issues from the ground. And if solutions have to be found, it's not grant makers who have to find those solutions, but people who are getting impacted by whatever the situation is that need to find the solutions. So that's the first step. So whatever it takes to get there is what participatory grant making ought to kind of be doing. And I really feel that at some level, some of these very crucial elements need to be incorporated. For example, unlearning. How do you actually unlearn what you have seen for a lot of time? So you do need to learn. You do need to kind of bring in experiences from various sources, but unlearning is also very crucial. So that you don't go in with a very, very clear mindset and say that this has got to be done. This is the way, and this is the framework of work that we're going to do, and this is the log frame. So the moment you kind of think of log frames, that are pre-decided, you are sure that you're not going to be participatory in that entire process. You might say we will do a participatory impact assessment, but actually it's not, because the outputs have already been kind of listed out, the outcomes have already been worked out in your head, and then you will kind of try to do a whole lot of work in that direction. So unlearning is critical. The second most important thing which I think donors need to work on, and how participatory processes will change that, is how do you actually approach communities with a bit of humility, with knowing and saying, I don't know what needs to get done. Let's think about what needs to get done. Let's think and talk and give that entire process time and find out what needs to get done. It's not a solution. We don't have the solution. And maybe the aspirations, the lives, the lived conditions and lived realities of everybody will kind of play a part, including us, the donors, including the NGOs that are delivering the program. But importantly, together, how does that humility and saying I don't know become a part of participatory grant making? I think that's very, very critical. And eventually, you've got to say, you've got to get into a situation where the entire process, and Paramit has mentioned it, and Jimmy also did, that ultimately the process is critical. For example, the means, can the end justify the means, or do the means justify the end? And I think that analysis needs to be done at every level. And I personally feel that, at some level, the means are more important, the processes are more important. And even if it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of time. What we're dealing with is persistent problems, stubborn problems, as Paramita said, which require a lot of effort and a lot of time. I often say that, a marketing problem is centered around 4 Ps, the product, price, promotion, and placement, and all that you kind of judge and fix together, and you have a solution to your marketing problems. But here we are dealing with almost 700 parameters. There are so many parameters that we have to kind of think and understand about and bring into the thinking process. So I think it's important to kind of look at that. Another very important element which I kind of would like to talk about is strengths. You mentioned it, Jenny, a little while ago, but I just like to elaborate a little bit more and say, do we approach communities only with their vulnerabilities, or do we approach them with their strengths? How much time do we spend in actually kind of understanding what are the strengths of the community? Because it's those strengths that we need to kind of be able to work on. And if we want participatory processes, we've got to respect those strengths. We've got to respect the aspirations of the people and their strengths. And often like so many grant making proposals that we see or development programs that we see always talk about the desperate vulnerabilities of the people. They never talk about the strengths of the people. Yes, the vulnerabilities are there. There is no disagreement about it. But try and also look at the strengths that they have. So I think it's important to kind of understand that. The moment you kind of say that you don't know, that you're approaching a process with humility, that you're willing to unlearn, you will be in a position to share that power. So sharing power is a statement. Yes, we have to share the power. How does it happen? It happens only when I accept that I don't have all the power. And that power has to be joined, power has to be kind of shared, and the strength and the power of the communities in that entire process is what will actually make the difference. The moment you kind of bring all this together, then essentially what you're saying is we have to understand all the systems that are impacting those communities, which are causing those vulnerabilities and are causing the strengths to not be recognized. And if we understand that, and we understand the entire system that is actually kind of playing out its part, then your grant making begins to analyze each and every element of that system. And the moment you kind of analyze each and every element of that system and are able to address and spend time on addressing those elements, the systems approach begins to kind of take over. And the moment you do this, you know that it's a long process, that you have to be there for the long haul. It's not something that can be done very, very easily and very immediately. If it is a long haul, then you have to ensure that you're, as a donor, there for a significant amount of time. And if you're not going to be there for a significant amount of time, you are working in collaboration with other donors who will help that entire process continue. And often, in the development thinking over the past 10 years, 15 years, we've heard the word sustainability quite often. And I'd like us to kind of start looking at the word continuity rather than just sustainability. It's not about sustaining an NGO. No NGO needs to sustain itself forever, but an NGO needs to be able to have the funds to continue its work for the long haul if you're going to be working with communities that require our support. So continuity, working for the long haul, I think that's going to be an important way forward. So the moment you say participatory, all of this comes into play. And if you're not going to be addressing all of these issues, then and I'm looking for impact very, very quickly, then somehow I think you're on the wrong track. And I would like to kind of emphasize that in recent times the word impact has come up in our development funding so often, and I think it's a word that is perhaps not being understood very correctly. When you're looking at impact, and particularly things like impact funding. The moment you say impact funding, you say, and then you have things like impact bonds that come up. You're immediately saying, I don't care about the process. I don't care about the process. I am interested only in the final outcome. You get paid for the money, for the work that you do. You get me the final outcome and we'll pay you. So the moment you do that, you're killing the entire process. And if you're killing the entire process, then you're not actually kind of looking at all the stuff that I've kind of mentioned in terms of strengths. And I think one last point I'd like to make, Jenny, is that it is really, really critical that we look at some of the communities, and I agree again. Dr. Sukhdev Thorat mentioned it, that very few organizations have communities like scheduled castes and tribes on their immediate priority list. But I'd say one more set of groups needs to be kind of incorporated into this thinking, and that is the denotified tribes of India. I think we are talking about a 15% population in the country today. And if we're not looking at denotified tribes and the situation that they are in, where there is even starting off with a lack of citizenship, so I think it's important that we kind of, and this I'm just bringing in the points that Dr. Sukhdev Thorat made, that we have to kind of look at it and prioritize our funding as well. So I'll stop there for the moment, and in case there are other points, I'll kind of come in. Thanks. Sorry, Joseph, for taking up your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sachin. I think for me, you raised a couple of really difficult challenges that we face. I think when we try to understand a situation, the solutions that we come up with in our mind are so precious to us. We've gone through that process and we think, oh, now I get it. Now I think I get it. And then to step back from that is so difficult. And the other balance that you're suggesting that, again, personally, I find so difficult is the impatience with what people are going through, and yet the sense that we have to give the process time, otherwise we're not going to get there. And as a professional practice, this is just so difficult to handle, isn't it? Anyway, I'll come back to Joseph and see if your internet is more accommodating this time, and we'll bear with it if it does cut out. Okay.
Well, I hope so. Thanks, Sachin. Thanks, Vinny. That's part of all types of development work we do, right? Getting out the realities of where we are from. But then, I've got so many, Tom reaching out, several of you are reaching out, saying that, we are there. It's just that you have been out, so I'm happy. So it's in a way, being inclusive. I'll kind of start off from where I had left out. So basically, I was saying donations or funding basically has three major components when you really want to look at it from a participatory, approach. One is ultimately the person who holds or the entity that holds the money. There's a knowledge dimension to it, and then finally the civil society expertise. Because all of these three together, for me, would translate genuine participation, if at all we would really want to do it. So first thing is whether participatory giving is possible or not. Yes, it is, giving is possible, and it should be there in all approaches. But it all starts with naturally the person who wants to give. Because if the intention at the beginning itself is not there, then it just does not happen. So if there is a will, yes, it is doable. Now, having said that, I think we still have a lot of challenges too, because when we look at the genuine giving part of it, and I think Romita and Sachin, both of you, and Gini too, kind of mentioned it in different dimensions of it. For example, the real disparity within communities and also the levels of participation that is possible does make it quite challenging. One. Second, I think from the funder's perspective, well, at the beginning of the year or 5-year plan or whatever, 5-year max probably, you already have a strategy in place in most cases, which kind of ties you down with multiple layers, if not just one or two. And then on a shorter term perspective, specifically for professionals who are part of this, you have your KPIs, you have your, annual outcomes that you have to look at, and quote unquote impact that you have to create, which again, kind of guides you in certain ways in which probably the processes might get diluted a bit. Having said so, I think the tough part is that, but I think the best of it is if you can be patient and if you can make the long run at having people associated with you so that, you can actually carry on the processes in the right way. So irrespective of what you may have actually decided or probably even collectively agreed on a certain outcome, but the outcome has to change because of the realities that have come through in front of you, you probably will be better positioned down the line than otherwise. And I think it's all a matter of, from my personal experience, I feel participatory giving is all a matter of helping people to understand that the outcomes finally make it much more fruitful. Sustained, of course, I cannot say because it's still a short time since I personally have really kind of, strongly got involved with it. Maybe you look at it 20, 25 years down the line and back, then say we can say sustainability, but then at least it's more fulfilling and gratifying from all segments of it. Now, I think I can talk of two major experiences that we have had, and thanks to Praxis, who've been part of this journey with us from the beginning, from community development initiatives, where, we genuinely looked at how we would want to kind of, make the participatory approach of giving genuinely there at the field level. So be it from the needs assessment, we had all approaches in a very participatory approach, including, selection of partners and proposal developments. There was nothing written down saying that, okay, fine, this has to be done. It was all based on what the community required and how it had to go through. And we were very, very, I think, providentially, blessed that we got the right people and the right entities to part. Of course, Praxis, we all know about it. Tom being a good friend, we were able to kind of, go through the process collectively. So when we actually went through real implementation of it, it was a 5-year integrated development program. So what initially was decided or envisaged from the holdings company of mine and the ground realities of the panchayat that we were working with, and what we actually implemented were very, very starkly different. Not just that, down the line when we continued implementing, at the end of first year we had a participatory evaluation done, and based on which there were many more changes brought into the implementation again. So we were able to kind of genuinely kind of make it a very dynamic process. It's a very organic process of involving people continuously, and to the end of how we would want to kind of reach where we wanted to. Second aspect that I can talk about is from an experience that I have from Africa, which we are working there in Uganda, of an education project that we have. There again, COVID brought in a lot of new opportunities, of course, and challenges too. So our intervention was somewhere midway in between where COVID had hit. So most of it was online to begin with, though we had the interactions prior to that. So what the challenges that COVID brought in made us think of participation in different dimensions of how it is possible. Online, how do we do it? And thankfully, again, the partners that we had genuine desire of continuing that practicum of real, giving. And I think the whole aspect of participatory giving can only happen when all the stakeholders involved are, equally aligned to it. Many a time when donors, I'm sure, all donors in this group would agree with it. When you're wanting to start a new initiative, many a times the implementing organizations we shortlist to kind of implement the project, or even entities, can be individuals also, ask you two basic questions. What do you want us to do? What is your focus area? Second, how much money do you have? What is your budget? These are basic two questions they ask. Now, these two questions, if you answer, you're actually narrowing the whole thing. No participation happens in that. So one of the strategies that we have followed in all our giving is that we don't answer both those questions. We say that we don't have a focus on, okay, this is a geographical area that we want to work. That is a given. Because of whatever, realities that we are in, we say that, okay, fine, this is an area that we would want to work. And we would want to at least work for 5 years. So that's our given. Budget, we never tell them what the budget we have in mind, because we generally don't have a earmarked money for it. Yes, there are larger, pots that we have, saying that, okay, fine, there is certain funds available, but giving that number upfront, then actually make them to kind of think and, align with whatever is already made and cut. So you try to fit into what is there, than to kind of explore and try to realize, what needs to get done. And from our, experience, and also from my earlier experiences, I can always share that if you already give a budget, most often they either cut corners or they stretch. Now, both of that is not going to help us in any way. And finally, last point I would want to kind of mention, and probably it relates to what Professor Thorat had to mention in terms of development and the different policy levels and approaches that we had over the years. I think somewhere down the line, we still are very much aligned with development being, synonymous with economic growth and, poverty eradication. Yes, if you look at the needs theory, the basic, Maslow's needs theory, the basic 2 tiers have to, of course, been kind of considered. But can we also look at in terms of from larger aspects of fulfillment and happiness? I mean, is it, yes, the basic things have to be kind of taken care of. Don't get me wrong. But, if you look at people around the room and all of us, after a period of time, when you hit your mid, 40s and 50s, and, you start thinking, okay, fine, where have I reached? We probably earn to kind of do things much more simpler, much more in a what you call joyful manner than the whole big jargons and the discussions that we may be having. Now, can that also be related with people whom we work with? The reason I tell about this is to, again, from my experience from the field, there were these young people whom we were working with in Uganda, youngsters who had dropped out from school post around the COVID time. But then we know through our implementing organization, because working through a school there, the school was very interested to kind of get them back on. And they did try getting them back on also. But then a month and a half in the process, they realized that these youngsters who had dropped out and had found some sort of, gainful employments, whatever they are, of course, all legal and neat and clean, nothing illegal. They were more happy doing that job than probably coming back to, the school and being in the system that the school was trying to tell them. And they were contributing much more to their families and the communities than otherwise. So it came down to a situation where the choices had to be made, whether, we help them in that process of, learning and probably, having a fulfilling life in the way they decided that they wanted to go, than probably, enticing them with support mechanisms within, keeping them in this so-called structure that you and I kind of agree with. Okay, there has to be a, K to 12 and then the 3-year, etc., etc. So in that aspect of, an ecosystem approach of what we call education that we envisaged, we felt like, it was more appropriate for the people to make their decisions and decide for what they wanted to do than probably deciding how we would want to take on. And I think the reason I mentioned this here is that in a community development approach, we always mention about felt needs and real needs. And as professionals, we always are told that start with the felt needs so that you get the community's participation, the rapport development happens easier, etc., etc. But then at the end of the day, as professionals and grantors, at the back of your mind, you already have the real needs where you want them to, all this to be channeled to. So is it in a way like, is that genuine participation? I mean, is it in a way saying that, okay, fine, that's what you and I think that the people that we are working with, be it denotified tribes, be it tribals, be it SCSTs, any community that we are working with, or the urban homeless, don't we need to kind of genuinely ask that question and, let them. I'm in a way very, very blessed that, I had that opportunities of working. My board allowed me to kind of have that space where that was possible. And thanks to Praxis and the team that we had and the implementing organizations we had, we were able to really experiment some of those and, genuinely find real results and, seeing that people were happier and, of course, more gratifying in what we were doing than if we had done it the other way around. I think on that note, I'll stop and then we'll have more discussions later.
Thanks so much, Joseph, for those insights. I'm glad you managed to come back to us. I think one of the things you were emphasizing is the need for all the stakeholders that are supporting the work to be aligned on participation. And I think that's rarely the case, right? That that's what we experience, that some of us would love to do more participation, but we're stuck with some impact that we have to deliver to some outsiders, and we can't negotiate for that to change. So I think that's an important thing to wrestle with. And then, you know, this practical tool that I hadn't really thought of not telling the people that you're trying to work with what it is you're trying to achieve, so that then they don't just echo what you've said the purpose is. So that I'm going to think about how do we do that? Is that a useful thing? And again, my practice is to tell people how much money is available, so they don't waste their time either asking for too much or too little. But that again is a good idea that I'm taking away as well. Can I be more flexible on that one? I don't know whether any of the panelists have a particular point that you'd like to come back on that one of the other panelists has raised, or whether you'd like me to put another question to everybody. Just want to give you a moment to jump in if there was something that you really wanted to come back on.
If Ginny, I just wanted to kind of reiterate one point that you made, or I think it was Paramita who made that, but eventually a lot of development work that we do, you know, is experimental in nature. It is developmental in nature. We don't really know the routes that we are following. You know, every community, every issue that we work on often has many kind of different directions it can go to. And therefore, I think one critical element of participatory thinking also is about knowing that there will be failures. You know, that we can't expect everything to be hunky-dory all the time. And, you know, giving the partners and communities the confidence, you know, that failure is an acceptable outcome of intervention is a very critical part of participatory processes. And I think at some level, and I think, Joseph, you made the point that, you know, it starts with people who are saying, I'm going to give the money. You know, and how that person is actually kind of looking at it. So I think it is important that at some level, when we are talking about philanthropy and talking to this, and we're talking to individuals who are willing to share their money on this developmental journey, to bring them into this element and say, don't always expect success. That we are going to be on a very difficult path. In the complexity, I'm not trying to make it more complex than it is. It is complex already. But the fact is that we have to understand the complexity and the nature of the work that we're doing. You know, we are being also hit on all directions, you know, by the way the economy is going, by the way the society is, by the way developmental processes outside are taking place. So there is a high degree of failures that will accompany participatory processes, and therefore accepting that. And I think it's important that this discussion happen more and more, because the tendency today in terms of, you know, the sources of fund, which is increasingly becoming CSR, you know, is going to make it all the more difficult, because, you know, CSR always wants to be able to project a certain degree of success, you know, and let their shareholders know that they are doing some absolutely great work. But understanding and educating people on the developmental processes that actually we go through is something that we have actually, I think, missed out on. And maybe, I mean, and I know Praxis has done a lot of documentation on some of these issues, but it is actually very important to speak about processes much more in coming times.
Yeah, I think my thoughts about failure, Sachin, are let's try to make them worthwhile failures rather than the same old failures that we've suffered in the past. Is you know, to run worthwhile experiments that we actually learn from, rather than just making the same old mistakes that we've made for decades. Yeah.
Shall I, Ginny?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, couple of more thoughts I would think. One is I agree with Sachin mentioning that, two aspects of it. One is the failure component, the other one is the CSR aspect, which have got huge implications to India very much, because one is the aspect of because see, they don't match actually. If you look at CSR funding being the most now available, and international funding becoming more difficult to come by, and the whole aspect of looking at failures and learning from it, which is very difficult, because exactly what Sachin said, because CSR funding ultimately wants to project something great that they have done or good that they've brought about. So automatically the communication lines, you can juggle around the words and bring it in such a way that it's a rosy good picture at the end of the day. So the learning, unfortunately, may not be so much. And that actually brings in some tough questions for us also. The other component is that, the whole aspect of micro versus macro, in terms of how large can you have an entity or universe of intervention, and how effective participation can be, and vis-a-vis the policy formulation, because policy formulation, as we know, is a governmental exercise, and the decision made maybe at panchayat level probably, but then most of it at state and the national level has got huge implications of what happens at the grassroots level. Now, in that scenario, how do you kind of engage with policymakers so that the policy itself supports larger participatory processes, which is very difficult given the new era realities that we are in, where civil society is always seen as more as the other side of the table than along with the development workers, be it within the government or otherwise. Now, in that scenario, I think we have been successful very much in a micro level, where it has gone up to, let's say, ours has been more panchayat, and an assembly constituency is the maximum that we have gone to, maybe across multiple panchayats, but not across states and others. So how do we scale this up is an important question, because the need is so huge, and specifically when you have the spectrum, like for example, any developed scenario that we looked at has got all of it, which I was mentioning. We have the very, very lowest under poverty families to the super rich, and in an focus where economic growth is being aligned, as Professor Thorat mentioned about the inverted U curve, extreme. You see that COVID has actually only accelerated it. So it's only made the rich more rich, poor probably, yes, more poor, but then there has been a little spread of wealth maybe, but then the difficulty is that the flattening of that curve is not happening so much. So when you look at it, I was just trying to understand it. Maybe you have an inverted U, but then you have a U after that also. So it's kind of a roller coaster wherein the disparities just keep widening. So how do we kind of bring about that from a macro perspective? And well, as I said, my understanding, my knowledge on that is very, very limited. The only, at this point of time, what I see is probably policies that kind of impact geographies across districts and states is where one probably has to kind of look at. But then again, the powers that be need to be listening. If that listening is not happening, then naturally whatever we are talking about is not going to be kind of getting implemented. And there is that big challenge, and I think this is something that I've struggled all along in my professional career, working at very grassroots to board meetings. At a micro level, you at least succeed quite a bit in terms of participation and genuineness and how you're kind of using resources. But then when you look at larger policies being made, the small and I'm not saying small is small, but then from a larger perspective it is small. Probably a panchayat level or a sub district level is small from a geographical perspective, but then from the individual it's the whole world. So you're actually impacting the whole world of the families there, of the villages there. But then when you take it from a nation perspective, it is small. But then the policy that get made, really, really take the larger perspective several steps back, if not, huge generations. So that, disconnect and probably the worry, the sadness, the grief, and to a large extent anger also really burns, and then how do you kind of scale this up from these micro successful stories to impacting larger scales? Actually, that's a big question that always stays. And I only go by one professor who, TSN Pillai sir, who really taught me participatory evaluation back then, was that, Joseph, see, don't worry about that. It's painful, but then if you and people like you were not doing the smaller ones for the villages and the families there, even that would not be there. So let's all, kind of be, trying to kind of at least find some solace there. Having said so, I think the big question still stays. And I feel if we can really, because see, ultimately, if we can have donor communities coming together, as what we have seen in multiple times prior to the civil society being, kind of, using a nicer word, being sidelined in the development process, I think we have really seen funders really, focusing more on the right space, sustainability components. So if donors can come together and bring that together, that focus, I think we still can kind of make a change. I think it's not easy because, as Sachin rightly said, CSR has got a different, it's a different, what should I say, ball game, where the whole dynamics and ball game, quote unquote, in a nicer way, the dynamics of it is very different from the real development world that we have looked at. Now, don't get me wrong, there are genuine CSRs out there who are really doing some great jobs, and we should acknowledge that. It's just that, the world out there is maligned, and intertwined with power of politics, knowledge, and money, that all of that becomes a little difficult to kind of, fathom and really weed through. So I think we and people like Praxis and all of us have a larger role to play in trying to see how these micro success stories of participation at all levels can be kind of scaled up to larger levels.
Thanks, Joseph. I want to put that question back to Paramita and Sachin, especially about how do we go from the micro participatory processes that, yield such good results, but on a small scale, to having a larger effect, a macro effect, because we do need to get there somehow, don't we? Because, as you say, there's so much grief about what is happening, so much anger about how people are being treated, and we can't really just settle on, well, we've made this difference in a panchayat and we can see it, it's great. And as you say, it's changed the whole life of those people. I'm not sure that it's up to us to settle just for that. Somehow we've got to get to the macro level. Is there something we can learn from some of the more participatory social movements that perhaps panelists are aware of, that give us hope? Any reflections on how we go from the micro to the macro?
Yeah, Sachin, you want to start? Yeah, I can just share some of.
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay.
Please go ahead. I'll come in later.
Okay, so this is actually a question, I think, for which I don't think I have a clear-cut answer, but I think we are aware about this, right? And the way to think about is in a few ways. So one of the questions in the chat box was about the longevity of NGOs and how do the NGOs sort of, do the problems outlive the NGOs? So I think there is an answer to that. I mean, some of it is related to this question that you're asking. Like, if we continue to think that, these social problems are something that only the NGOs and donors can solve, I think that's the starting point of feeling very challenged and fatigued and grieved about, right? If in every opportunity that we are getting, what is the, I would say, opportunity what we are taking, or what is the leverage we are taking to, I hate to say this word, quote unquote, empower, but really pass on the decision making in the hands of the communities, right? If it is a 3-year project or a 5-year project or a program, are we investing enough in helping their leadership being built? See, these communities have a lot of connection with communities who are like, kindred kind of souls. So whether it is, if you talk about the forest rights movement or the anti-mining movement or stuff like that, these communities kind of come together at various platforms, right? So for me, if NGOs and donors think that they are the only vehicles to kind of scale it up, then I think this is like a very narrow view of what we are trying to achieve. The second thing is about who are our sort of peers, right? Right now, I am so comfortable talking to a Ginny and a Sachin because we are sort of like-minded souls, right? But there are some of these unusual sort of, supporters or donors who we are not aware about, right? And we are so critical about them. We sort of make this presumption that they will not understand or invest in this process. But I have seen that how young philanthropists from India, who are the second and third generation, take a very, very different stance from their sort of founder generations or the three generations prior to them. And they are willing to take this challenge. They're willing to adopt new ways of grant making. They're willing to learn from civil society organizations. And they have that talent to bring the right people into their organization. So do we do enough in try to creating this larger community of supporters? And when I say supporters, it's both the donors, and the practitioners. So I think we need to kind of do enough and therefore see how well we are documenting our experiences around PGM and helping these newer sort of community of donors understand and learn from these sort of processes, right? See, the risk-taking ability of donors will always lie in a spectrum, right? I mean, it can never be the same. So we have to understand that a corporate may have a slightly lower risk-taking ability over a private philanthropic organization who is founded on maybe a sort of lot of experience. It also takes at what level you are. So I guess the one thing that I feel is if we have to achieve scale, we need to expand the community of people who support this process and help them through a learning journey as well. 10 years ago, we also did not have such nuanced understanding about PGM. We are also still learning, right? So we have to allow that space for newer organizations to come on board, experience, and then take the decision. Yeah. That's all from me.
I think that's
Thanks,
a brilliant insight. Yeah. I just wanted to say, just to highlight that idea of investing strongly in local leadership is crucial. We've got to do that. And then building a community that's evolving of donors that are willing to take risks and are on a journey with us of learning what that takes. Yeah. Was Sachin, you were trying to come in there? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to also look at the modeling that we do while scaling up. For example, you have the McDonald's model of scaling up, where you have a single idea, single process, and a replication of that idea all over the world. So that's one model of scaling up. But you also have in India Udupi model, Udupi restaurants, which are all different, which are all individually owned, but do the same kind of work. So they have probably a slightly different menu, but they essentially kind of providing the same kind of food in different locations, and the kind of also not the same. So there are lots of people doing the same kind of work. So one way to actually kind of look at scaling up is to kind of multiply the numbers of organizations that are working on ideas. So the larger the number of people working with communities, whether you do it at the panchayat level or at the block level, I don't know. But the idea is that we need a whole lot of facilitative processes. And the more we build these facilitative processes up, the more scaling up can actually happen. The problem sometimes that we kind of get into is that we want to scale up a single idea. And that's where the multiplier kind of fails, because then one element gets multiplied. So, I mean, without kind of being critical of organizations, I'm just kind of saying this as a learner. But, for example, if there is one element that gets scaled up to 20,000 villages, it doesn't really change anything. Because those are not these critical elements that actually, and if you're looking at communities and people, we are actually kind of looking at it from a context of the system kind of impacting their lives. So a poor family, a vulnerable family does not kind of have just one element that you can kind of tighten up and everything will start working. It doesn't never work like that. So it requires sustained work, but the larger number of people doing this sustained work is one way of scaling up. So one option is to kind of fund more and more organizations, smaller organizations, maybe working with just 5 families, but the entire process. Let smaller, I mean, let more and more ideas kind of, and more organizations bloom is my kind of way of looking at this scaling, which might require, an organization like Praxis to come in and say, well, we kind of helping create more and more people who can do this facilitated process, because we are also working in a system. As Praxis, if Praxis, and this is exactly the kind of grant that we actually made to Praxis in Bihar. The idea that 10 more young people with their own thinking and philosophy and willing to kind of work with communities, find their space in this new world, and young people take on the challenge of looking at how working in a participatory manner with communities can find solutions that emerge from the communities. The second point is that we've also got to recognize that it's not often when we talk about scale, we look at low cost solutions. The argument for scale is that we are looking at low cost solutions. Development processes are not low cost. They require investments, they require significant investments, and we've got to be able to make sure that we are willing to kind of make those investments. So I think giving a larger number of people the opportunity to work with communities, and also looking at how we strengthen smaller initiatives all over. Let me also say that it's not as if we have not impacted scale. For example, if you look at the Forest Rights Act, if you look at right to education, if you look at the right to information, these are all small initiatives that started off in really kind of remote places. And right to education, particularly, I'd say, is 25,000, maybe 25,000 numbers, but lots of people working independently in lots of spaces, experimenting and trying to understand what can be best done in the education space. When they all got together, it kind of rolled into creating the right to education movement. Now it's been 15 years since that happened. Maybe it's time to kind of relook at it. But it's always going to be this spiraling system that we have to kind of work on. As civil society, continue to look at the spiraling of efforts and how each effort leads to more efforts. Forest Rights Act is another classic example. There were 100 people working with communities on forest issues. At some point, all of this came together to force the government to think of the Forest Rights Act. It was an impact that the civil society had collectively on the system. It does not matter whether one organization does it or the other, but it is these collective experiences. And the more experiences that we are able to generate, the more support we are able to give civil society organizations to do this participatory kind of work, we will see a lot of this coming together to actually make the larger impact. So it's not as if we have not worked on larger impact as a civil society. We have. And there are at least 20 laws. That's the maximum that we can go to. Perhaps we need more thinking on how to make the laws more effective and so on. But that's the next level of thinking. So that's where I'd say that scaling up is possible, but let's not kind of limit our scaling up to one element, which tends to be happening. And if scaling up has to happen, let the entire process be scaled up. So we have an entire Udupi model rather than just Italy being sold all over the place without the sambar.
Thanks so much, Sachin. That's actually quite encouraging, isn't it, to look back on those other examples of how things happened, and that idea of multiplying the number of organizations that are doing participatory work and are thinking independently, and then just having faith in it that it will come together, because it has in the past. So I think, yeah, we need to keep a focus on that. We've got about, I think, 15 minutes left. What I want to do is move on to some questions in the chat, if that's okay with the other panelists. Yeah, shall we look at some of those? One of the ones here is from Sachin Kumar, who I think is actually my colleague. So I hope I'm not doing favoritism here. In the current scenario, we're experiencing the dominance of getting results instead of process, which is what we've talked about. And it doesn't limit to CSR only, but even many foundations and INGOs leadership coming from competitive background, influenced by results and undermining the process. We often talk about donor education, but it doesn't work because institutional captives and their own experiences from corporates. How to address this concern, because over the period it is increasing rapidly and overwhelming the sector. So I think we've touched on some of this, and I think, as Paramita was saying, the need for donor education and as well as our own education, but that sense of people being captives of that corporate notion of competitiveness and payment by results and all of that. Does anyone have any insights they want to share with Sachin on that?
I can. Just a couple of thoughts. One is, I think the donors per se, whether it is the international non-profits or CSR, the educative dimension is true, but at the same time, as you say, results are results. I mean, there are two ways in looking at results. One is the results that you had set out to achieve and whether you're achieving it or not, and what the actual results are there on the field, which may be kind of very different from, may not be very, but slightly different from what we are, and maybe in some cases very different also. It's tough for CSR and international non-profits to kind of come to a situation where, all the funding that had come and no results. That becomes very difficult for them to kind of, accept. But see, from our experience, we know that it's never a case. There are always results. So I think, personally, I feel it's all about how you're packaging it in terms of, how you're communicating this and sharing with the board in terms of what has been achieved vis-a-vis, what we wanted to achieve. So yes, there is a difficulty in terms of, saying that, okay, there are results to be achieved and we need to go at those. However, I think going forward even from the participatory approaches that we say, when everybody's got together, we ultimately all together have to come together and decide what needs to get done. And when we have decided what needs to get done, I think there is a process to be followed of reaching there. As we have all, kind of multiple times mentioned, whether it is a McDonald's model or the Udupi model, end of the day, there is a burger or a masala dosha with chutney and sambar available to eat. Now, if you say that, okay, I'm going for the Udupi model and no masala dosha at all, then you have a major challenge, right? So the whole aspect is saying that, okay, fine, the dosa is not a masala dosa, it's a roast or a, uttapam or whatever. I mean, end of the day, there is something to take away. So I think that education is very important. And thankfully, I think, I see a lot more donors kind of open to that. It's only when, people come with, kind of very, very strict timelines and log frames and M&E matrices saying that, okay, this is what I'm supposed to measure and this is all that I've got to measure, then you have a challenge. However, I think as Paramita was saying, one of the best things that I've seen in recent times, specifically COVID times, is that people are ready to kind of accept new information, new knowledge. And this very much is so with young philanthropists, because they genuinely see, one of the things is that, let's not beat around the bush. They also have realized that, 40, 50 years of funding of whatever donations that have come through, what is the end result of it? We are talking about great achievements, but yes, you still have the illiterate people, you still have the unskilled people, you still have people under poverty. So the young minds are not like that. The young minds are looking at, okay, fine, where can that genuine change be there? The only aspect that I see is that people have, are wanting to have faster results. It's not that they are wanting to undercut processes. It's just that they're looking at faster results. So if we can, as a collective, look at, okay, how do we, speed track what we're trying to do? Processes are important, but are there ways in which, some of those processes can be clubbed? Is there new knowledge available that what we did, let's say, 20 years before is not what we need to do in this era because, technology has changed, things are more different. So if that can be brought in, I think we can have much more, alignment in both processes, outcomes, results measurement, and finally the giving of resources to what needs to be achieved.
I am really tempted to come here, Ginny, if I can come in.
Please do, yeah.
So I think for the question about, how do we transform the decision makers in INGOs and the leadership who is setting a very competitive sort of environment. One of the things that we have to acknowledge is that we are very poor in documentation, right? And when we do the documentation of these experiences, it is only from a very social justice kind of a language to say that this is what we did. And again, we don't document enough. I think Praxis and some of the organizations are a minority in this group, who does it. So one of the things is if we have to really impress upon people who still use a very competitive framework, is to really have very compelling examples to say that how does it kind of a change. The related point is to Joseph's point about rapid sort of outcomes. I think how do we also use the word about the durability of the outcomes? If we do a cost analysis of a PGM versus the sort of more conventional approach, I think if you do a costing over a period of time, you will see, and I'm sure about this, that you are actually investing less if you take a 10-year, 15-year time frame. Because in a typical top-down project, after a 3-year period, there is nothing left on the ground. And when I say nothing, it's actually nothing. It all evaporates with the exit of the NGO and the funder, and the community is left back into the lurch because there was no participation in the first phase. Here, you're talking about a solid foundation of community who, through their own leadership and active citizenship, takes that process forward. I'm using the word of Sachin, which talks about continuity. So the corporate boards, the more competitive sort of INGO leaders understand economy also. So we also have to add this component about when we document or when we bring these testimonies, we have to bring this testimony from two counts, talking about the social outcome, but also in terms of the economic outcome. I see that we need to kind of, wrap our heads together and see how we do it as a community, because only Praxis doing it will not be enough, right? We have to do it together as a community. Yeah.
Thanks, Paramita. That was really helpful. I think that idea of the durability of the outcome and then analysing it from the point of view of, perhaps more competitive thinkers is quite helpful.
Yeah. Ginny, I wanted to add to what Paramita said, that, it's true that we've got we document these things in, a rights-based language of a lot of social justice references and so on. But, like a lot of language from the corporate sector is kind of disseminating into the social sector. For example, impact bonds is not a social sector terminology. Impact assessments, they came in much later. It wasn't exactly the social sector. A lot of this, kind of speed and time and corporate efficiency, these are words that are also being kind of introduced into the social sector. I think it's also important that we play a role in helping the larger development community, which includes us, includes the corporate sector, includes CSR, also understand this terminology. We often use this terminology, but we don't actually kind of spend time understanding and explaining this terminology. So social justice, for example, or whatever Dr. Sukhdev Thorat was talking about in the morning, we are as a community also failing to understand or explain the whole issue of affirmative action. So at some level, in addition to just writing our reports, we've got to also be able to do a glossary of these terms. And what is it that we mean when we say social justice? What is it that we mean when we say affirmative action? Or in the Indian context, reservation? What is, we often use the word intergenerational. Now, as a developing community, we probably understand it. But does a CSR head who's actually a management graduate from Yale, who is running human resources in the company, does he or she understand this intergenerational poverty or intergenerational change process? It's not easy, and I think there's a lot of work that we need to do, and it's not. I'm kind of looking at Tom when I say, actually, I think Praxis needs to also now look at its next 25 years, and saying how do we actually bring in some of this into the discussion. I remember when we started off, at least when I started off in the early 90s, working with communities, we had this amazing tool, we went through the participatory processes, training and so on. And the PRA was just beginning at that point of time. We had RRA and Robert Chambers, and PRA came in later, and so on. So we were just kind of getting to know this. But new tools for young people in today's day and age, particularly also reaching out to young people in CSR and the corporate sector, helping them to understand the development language is important. I remember one very nice book which Priya had brought out called Square Pegs and Round Holes, or was it Praxis? And it was an amazing kind of startup book, at least for me. I don't see much of that kind of literature and documentation coming out now. So I think it's important that we actually, as a community, also invest a lot in improving the ecosystem within which we're working.
Yeah, the other thought I have about that, Sachin, is it's about language, it's about having some literature, it's having some tools, but I think it's also about exposure. I think, for me, how I began to learn about the intergenerational nature of poverty and debt bondage was simply sitting with people in their context and them explaining how they got into the situation. And I think sometimes that's lacking in perhaps the CSR experience, and that does take some organization and some careful thinking about it. But perhaps it's our next task really is to help that to happen. We've just got a few more minutes. I'm just wondering if we can take one more question. I'm looking at the Praxis heads up there, they're nodding at me. So let's take this last one from Rajiv Roy. Really interesting and educative discussion. Thank you, panelists. I want to know about how to ensure participatory grant making where a problem is normalized or not recognized by the community. For example, human trafficking is still alien to many source communities, or sexual violence against boys is still not recognized by the organization. So I think the idea is you're trying to stimulate participation, and you're coming in with perhaps an agenda of concern about human trafficking or concern about sexual violence against boys, but the people that you want to participate are not really even seeing the problem. So how do we have the right tools and processes to help those problems to surface? Any of the panelists want to jump in on that one?
Oh, well, urging me to go? Okay. I think, that's exactly where, we were saying whether the right sets of the actual, because you have already identified a major area of work, and a focus is already given to what you want to work on. However, in this case, the community or the people whom you want to work with are not aware of it or not ready to acknowledge it. I think participatory approaches become very, very difficult, not just in this kind of scenarios, but any hard to reach scenarios, because the fact that they are hard to reach, and the fact that information available or even discussions about, maybe it can be because of taboo, it can be because people don't know about it, becomes very, very difficult from a participatory perspective. Now, having said that, I think in my work with refugee camps, one of the things that I've realized in helping these, specifically in refugee camps, there's so many, legal, quasi-legal, illegal aspects that happen with all the goodness that can be there, is that specifically in terms of trafficking, is that to work with peers and probably help that component kind of take it forward in bringing in more discussions and what you call real issues upfront in how we want to tackle it. Now, having said that, I think in some of these social problems that we have, there is a larger power structure that is there, specifically in trafficking, drug abuse, illicit, whatever aspect of it. The larger components of it's beyond the normal developmental what you call variances that we normally see, whether it is gender, poverty, education, etc., literacy, etc., etc. So therein, I think the skill sets and the nuances of working together is much more what you call subtle, and probably a long haul working through peers, which help, because even if you look at targeted intervention, when we had the whole major HIV interventions that were happening, they were all done through peer interventions only. Most of the success stories, if you see, have come through the peer intervention. I think that is one area I feel we can really take on. Having said that, I think just one maybe 30 seconds, Ginny, on this whole aspect. I think I would urge all of us, of course, as we were mentioning, maybe just praxis may not be enough, but probably praxis can take a lead. See, praxis has worked at the community level, participatory, real leaders have been formed, great rights-based initiatives have happened. And also there is organizations like us and Partners in Change and who are really implementing through CSR. I think there is a big space of learning and educating the donor community also. Now CSR is there to be. Now, if we can actually help the CSR community, the donors as such, in urging them, in helping them to understand the whole aspect of participatory giving. As Ginny said, it can be actually going and seeing, exposure visits can be there, short-term interventions can be there. So it needs to be packaged in a corporate way, but if we can actually bring that about, I think, and convert some of the donors who are the decision makers in the giving components of it, I think the impact can be much more larger in how we want to take participatory giving.
Thanks, Joseph. Paramita or Sachin, do you want to come in on that question?
Do we have time? I just wanted to kind of respond to that question, earlier question from Rajiv. So I just look at it from a more generic perspective. Rajiv, I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer your question specifically. But if you look at it more generically, then it is a question of certain level of voicelessness. So we had in COVID, we saw thousands and thousands, lakhs of people walking back home. No one raised an issue about their situation as labor and the importance that labor plays in industry. I think the situation is all about voicelessness, not having a voice, not being able to say what I really feel about my situation. And I think it's really important that any intervention, and that's why I say that when we often go with a certain specific agenda, like say we want to stop trafficking, then we tend to kind of look at a solution to the problem that we've identified. But we're not really kind of finding a solution to the problem that the community actually has. And the first step in that is helping them get a voice and helping them articulate that problem. Are we in a position, do we have the tools and the methods by which we can actually help people and the community that you're talking about articulate their own reality? I think that articulation, and I think I would say that there are methods now in which you can use. We've used many community mobilization tools in the past, but there are other new ways in which we can actually bring in ways of actually helping people articulate their problems. And I point out to a partner that we funded called Janasanskriti, which uses theater as a method of actually helping communities voice what's there in their minds. And it comes from that basic assumption that communities are intelligent, They know their realities. It's just that they're not being able to articulate their realities. So how do you use modern, more relevant ways in which you help people articulate their problems? The moment they articulate them and the moment they understand it, then the process of solution finding on their part begins. Like I said, the moment we take a solution to communities, we will be expecting them to respond in a certain time frame, in a certain way, and in a certain kind of concept that we've already kind of finalized. That's not participatory processes. So if we really want to kind of help communities articulate their realities and find their own solutions, and Paramita, you said 3 years after the NGO is gone, nothing remains. That's because the solutions have been provided. The moment we provide solutions, the solutions stay till the time we are able to continue to provide them. But if the solutions are found, then they're internalized. And I think the ultimate end to participatory processes is that internalization of my reality and my solution for myself. And ultimately, being able to say that communities take decisions about their own lives from a position of strength. And that for me is where we've got to kind of get at somehow. I don't know the way. Sorry. Thanks.
Sachin, I think that's a wonderful place to actually stop. I think you've summed up so much of what we've said together and got to the heart of tackling that voicelessness. And if we can just help to achieve a voice for these people that we're trying to work with, that's what we need to be getting to. So thank you so much to the panelists here today, and thank you to Praxis for bringing us together. I think it's been a wonderful brainstorm. I think we needed much more time, but thank you. I'll hand back to Praxis.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ginny.
Thanks, Ginny, and thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
I just want to thank all of you. It's a wonderful discussion. So needed for the times, and moving ahead, looking forward. I think it's a critical aspect of development, the entire gamut of resource allocation, and you've kind of brought in so much rich dimension to this idea, problematized it, looked at the opportunities, showed some of the ways in which this can be furthered, and so on. Thank you so much. It was wonderful listening to all of you. Thank you.